Welcome once again to the Gaming News Canada show presented by GBG Plc. I'm your host, Steve McAllister. It's not a huge helping of hyperbole to call 2024 a transformational year for women's sport in North America. That was punctuated last week when Time Magazine anointed basketball superstar Caitlin Clark as its Sports Person of the Year. And here in the True North Strong and Free, teenage swimming sensation Summer McIntosh was the no-brainer recipient of the Northern Star Award as Canada's top athlete. McIntosh led Canadian women to 17 of our country's 27 medals at this summer's Paris Olympics, while more than half of the medals captured by Team USA at the Summer Games were delivered by Simone Biles, Katie Ledecky, Gabby Thomas, and other female athletes. And let's be clear here, this amazing year for women in sport isn't a one-off. The Professional Women's Hockey League dropped the puck on a second season with full arenas. The Northern Super League will launch our country's first women's professional soccer league next year, and the Toronto Tempo will begin play in the WNBA in 2026. And speaking of the WNBA, the league announced Monday, as we got ready to record this podcast, that the Atlanta Dream and Seattle Storm will play in the first regular season game outside of the U.S. next August at Rogers Arena in Vancouver. Somebody with a front row seat to the rise in women's sports over the past 6 years is the co-founder and head of content for The Gist, Ellen Hyslop, who joins us on today's podcast. Hey, Ellen, this is really, really hard to believe, but I think this is your maiden appearance on the Gaming News Canada show.
I know, Steve. Thank you so much for having me on. It's about time.
Yes, and I'll take the blame for that, Ellen. Let's make it clear. This isn't your fault. This is on me. So a written apology to come in email form, and but seriously, it's great to have you on the show. And right off the top, I want to just give the biggest congratulations to you, JC the Hoop. I hope I got JC right, and the entire gang at The Gist on recently being recognized by sports journalists, power players, and women's sports lists. That's the Sports Business Journal Award, right, Ellen?
Yes, it is. And thank you so much. That's really kind of you.
Yeah, and I've got so much respect for Abe Madcour and the people at Sports Business Journal. So this, it does seem like there tend to be a lot of awards and a lot of lists these days, but SBJ is one of the most credible publications out there in the North American sports industry. So it really is a feather in the cap for you and JC and the rest of the folks just to be recognized this way.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was so great to see ourselves on the list, but I think also to see the number of other media partners who we work with, a lot of other brands on there, a lot of athletes. And I think it's really cool to just reflect on the last, I'd say 6 or 7 years, Steve, where so many people who are featured on this list weren't even in sports or in media or thinking about spending in women's sports when we look back even those 6 to 7 years. And so it feels pretty transformative when you're looking at what SBJ was kind of covering with that list too.
I'd like to start there, Ellen, with this conversation, and six years ago, and before we hit the record button, I mean, I think The Gist is one of the best media stories in North America. I mean, often when we talk about the media these days, we see the shrinking newsrooms being decimated, radio stations shutting down, local news. I think we're in a bit of a crisis right now where we're losing local media outlets. And in The Gist case, I mean, I think you're a bit of a trailblazer kind of going down the newsletter route. And we've seen so many people follow suit since then, including us at Gaming News Canada. And in this industry, people like Steve Ruddick with the Straight Point to the Point newsletter, Dustin Gauker with the Closing Line, what Scott Longley's done with Earnings and More and Compliance and More in the UK. But you guys were a bit of a trendsetter. Can you just tell our audience how The Gist has evolved and where you are now in terms of subscribers and what you're doing to cover not just women's sports, but sports at large?
Absolutely. I'll do my best to give you the TLDR, I think, on our origin story and then where we were today. So we founded The Gist in 2017, which is wild to think back then. We were in our mid-20s. We were all working in financial services in downtown Toronto. And it was there where we really realized that sports are a social currency in our society. They have this really unique way of uniting people, regardless of age, race, gender, religion, who you're voting for, what have you. But we also noticed at the same time that for so many women and other underserved sports fans, they really felt like they were on the outside of the community looking in. I've always been a massive sports fan, Steve, always avid for as long as I can remember. For me as a female sports fan, that showed up in the way of never being invited to be part of a fantasy league. That showed up in having to prove my fandom constantly. For my co-founders who grew up playing elite sports, it didn't actually translate to fandom for them. And that's because they always felt like sports was this boys' club. And when we looked at the numbers, it really felt like the sports industry was forgetting women altogether. And we saw this not only as, oh my gosh, that's ridiculous and such a pain, but what an amazing business opportunity at the same time. We all graduated from commerce at Queen's, so we had that kind of mindset. At the time when we started the GIST, less than 14% of sports journalists were women, less than 5% of coverage was on female athletes or women's sports. And then the audience that ESPN was speaking to is actually over 75% male. And so we looked at this and said, no wonder why so many women and other people feel left out of the sports conversation looking in. So our business model is really around equal coverage of men's and women's sports. We know that as sports fans, we want to hear about the Seattle Storm, just as we want to be hearing about the Seattle Kraken. We want that news in the same place. All of our content is created by women and non-binary folks. And we're really focused on that underserved sports fan. So a little bit more of an everyday casual fan who's looking to get more into sports and is looking for a safe space to do so. And then I think, Steve, when we're thinking about media at large, at that time, we were thinking about how we were consuming news, period. And the way that we were consuming news was through our mobile phones and through our laptops. And in our laptops, it was mostly our work emails where we were getting the majority of our news. And so we thought the way to reach this new audience is to meet them where they're already scrolling and where they're already living, which is where the newsletter idea kind of came to be, where we started really connecting with our audience through Instagram. And then it kind of exploded from there. Since we launched in 2017, we've been incubated and accelerated by companies like Facebook, Comcast NBCU, Techstars, Billie Jean King Enterprises, and we now have a team of over 20 people full-time. We have over 1 million newsletter subscribers, which is really amazing. We provide content that's regionalized for Canada and the US and city-specific content for 10 different cities in the US. And so I think that really since 2017, we've proved that there's a different business model for not only the way in which we storytell and speak about sports, but the platforms and how and who you're speaking to them. And so I think really coming at it with a fresh perspective helped us to be able to properly solve a problem because we were that consumer that was feeling that problem so deeply.
I'm just thinking, Ellen, that we're recording this podcast on Monday, on December 16th, and I had a chance to read the newsletter before we came on here, and it takes me back to those days, that high of working in a newsroom, and you look, someone I think posted on the weekend, and this is one of the busiest times of the sports calendar. You have U.S. basketball and college basketball and football going on right now. The GIST dedicates a section to week 15 of the NFL regular season. The World Juniors are just around the corner. There's just so much going on right now. I can't imagine what it's like on a Sunday in the GIST, I guess, the virtual newsroom.
It's so much fun. We have an absolute blast kind of figuring out what we want to be chatting about. And I think over the years, we've done a really great job of understanding our Gisters' existing needs and then anticipating their future needs, understanding what the topic of conversation is going to be the next day when they're going into work, when they're talking with their sibling about XYZ game, what they need to know when they're, chatting with their friends in the lunchroom, that type of thing. But then also kind of layering all of the information that we do have about our 1 million subscribers, looking at their behavior, understanding our first party data, and really leveraging the way that we fully understand our audience to be able to create this personalized experience for them in our newsletter too.
I hope you put up with my sports media geekdom just for one more second, Ellen. And that's just, has there been one message from your subscribers or one significant change you've made to the way you cover sports just because of the feedback that you were getting from Gisters?
Oh my gosh, Steve, I feel like you've been a gister for a very long time. When we first started the gist, it was me who has a business background writing for the first ever time in my life. And I was writing it very casually, very like I was texting my best friends.
Right.
And as we continued to scale, that was not landing with everybody. And so as we've continued to grow, we've become more professional and a little bit more welcoming. I think that every single type of person, not necessarily someone who just wants to feel like they're getting a text from our writers, while at the same time still managing to stay like your witty, sports obsessed best friend who's keeping you in the know of what's going on. And we try to be sassy, we try to be entertaining, we try to curate everything that you need to know, and everything that you don't need to know. We literally don't even put in the newsletter. So I think our voice has evolved a lot. And I'd say in the last 2 years, maybe 3 years in particular, I feel like we've really hit our stride in our voice for sure. And then I think too, and this is a little bit more of a misconception in the industry and maybe not for us, Steve, but a lot of people think, okay, you're speaking to a female fan, they must only care about women's sports. Women actually care more about men's sports than they do about women's sports, but they are more likely than men to care about men's and women's sports equally. And that is why we also put men's and women's sports on the same playing field. And so, Steve, when you're talking about us talking about week 15 in the NFL or giving the preview for the NBA Cup, our gisters are eating that up. And they really do care about the men's side of sports just as much, if not more, than what they care about the women's side.
Yeah, and we've had Val Martinez, who founded bettingladies.com. We've had her on the podcast in the past, and she's talked about, she's created a sports betting content website because, again, there was demand from women, not just to bet on women's sports, but to bet on the NFL and the NBA and Major League Baseball and the National Hockey League. So yeah, there's definitely a misconception, and I say that as someone who shares my house with someone who watches as much male sports as I do, and who's very passionate about it. I do want to talk about women's sports for a few minutes, Alan, just because I don't think I'm blowing smoke when I mention that this was a transformational year. And when I was getting ready for this podcast, it feels weird to say that. You look at the names of women. You mentioned Billie Jean King earlier, and you look at the women who have been superstars in the world of sports. Well, Billie Jean's case, probably, you're going back 40 years or maybe almost a half a century. But, I just wrote down names. You think Chris Evert, Steffi Graf, Nancy Lopez, Kathy Whitworth, Serena Williams, Annika Sorenstam, even Nadia Comaneci and what she did at the 1976 Olympics in Montreal. And then, Haley Wickenheiser, what she did for women's hockey, and Mia Hamm and Megan Rapinoe, and obviously Christine Sinclair, who's just, called an end to her unbelievable career. Just it leads me to the question, like, why does it feel, Ellen, that it took Caitlin Clark to be that person to kind of get women's sports across whatever, a goal, I guess we'll call it a goal line, but it just feels like Caitlin Clark, it's almost like there were people out there that weren't paying attention to women's sports, or were just kind of, half paying attention. And all of a sudden Caitlin Clark comes around and it's like this light bulb goes off.
It's such a good question, Steve, and I feel like we've been running up to this moment in women's sports for a exceptionally long time. I think that we've had moments of it already. I think Serena Williams in tennis, namely, I think being the one in women's sports of at least my generation that really kicked things into high gear for women's tennis and the WTA in particular. I think with Caitlin Clark, I actually like to compare it, and people have compared this as well, to Tiger Woods. I think when you look at golf before Tiger, golf was for golfers, and people who played golf loved watching it. Otherwise, people really didn't care about it that much. And then all of a sudden, this guy named Tiger Woods comes along, and he's entertaining, and he's fun, and he's something different on the PGA Tour. I think it's very similar to that with Caitlin Clark, where all of a sudden she's able to take advantage of March Madness finally having the same branding on the women's side as the men's side. March Madness finally getting equal time on TV as the men's side and the women's side. March Madness, finally coming off of a really record WNBA year where people are already so excited about women's basketball, and her being able to go back-to-back years, making it to at least the Final Four. So her namesake is already trending in that direction.
Right.
And then you add on that she can hit such a deep three-pointer. We have been obsessed with Steph Curry for how many years? That is because he was a splash brother with Klay Thompson. Three-pointers are always going to jazz us up, and being able to see a young kid like Caitlin Clark out of Iowa, of all places, score three-pointers, I think that we were leading up to this moment. We were just waiting for that player who was going to take us to that next place, and she was there, the right place, the right time, fandom. What people wanted to support someone, and people wanted to help basketball get to that next place, and she stepped into it fully. And so you really have to tip your hat to her, because she really didn't hesitate.
Yeah, that's a great summary. I'll just mention too. I think like Tiger, I watched a lot of Caitlin Clark, especially the WNBA this summer, and just the vision she has, and not just
Yes.
a great 3-point shooter, but her passing. I don't know if that's appreciated enough. How she sees an open person and knows exactly where to put a ball. And it's a lot like Tiger, where Tiger hit the ball a long way when he came on the tour, but his stuff around the greens, like everybody remembers that shot at the mat, that just ridiculous shot at the Masters that he made, and thinking it's funny that as I talk here, you realize that Caitlin Clark and Tiger Woods are a lot alike, where they're, in terms of their mindset and the way they think the game, they're always one step ahead. It's like playing chess and being one step ahead of your opponent.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I saw with Caitlin Clark. And it's the one thing why, I really enjoyed watching her. And if I sitting at home on a Saturday afternoon and turn on my TV and there was a Indiana Fever game, I'm turning it on because I like watching her complete game, just her on court vision. And, I think she is a generational talent. And I think that's the one thing that's been frustrating for me is this, debate and the the petty stuff on social media around Caitlin Clark and other great WNBA players. And I don't know why we can't accept the fact that before Tiger Woods came, to your point, there were lots of great golfers, Arnold Palmer and Jack Nicklaus and Lee Trevino and Fred Couples, and we've seen and with Cheryl Swoops and all the Lisa Leslie and all the superstars in the WNBA, like nobody, I don't think most of us aren't diminishing what those great athletes have done, but as you just mentioned, you tip your cap to someone who's just found another level.
Yes, exactly. I agree with you there, Steve. And if you like her play, Paige Beckers on UConn for this season, for next season, the WNBA. And Paige, I think, takes it to the next level too, because she's a little bit more on social media, in the mix a little bit from a cultural and fashion perspective, that this next generation of hoopers is very exciting.
And there's kind of a rising tide lifts all boats here, right, Ellen? Like Tiger, before Tiger came along, most golfers weren't exactly known for spending a lot of time in the gym. And there was, you walk off the 18th hole and head straight to the 19th hole for a beer and a sandwich. And it feels to me like Caitlin Clark she's going to have an incredible impact on the next generation. Serena Williams, same thing, right? I think Serena, brought a new dimension to the game with her serve and her power game, and you see the players that have come now after Serena who play that power game as well. So those generational players or athletes are good for their sport because they force everybody else to get better.
Exactly. And we see that, right, too. I really like how you talked about Serena as well. I mean, you look at tennis athletes now and they look completely different, especially on the women's side. It's a much more powerful game. It's a much more finesse game almost at the same time too. Like somehow she made it so that you had to be powerful, but so accurate at the exact same time. Like these are these special players that we're just so lucky to be able to watch. And I think what's great about Caitlin Clark too is that, and this is maybe even more than a Tiger Woods or maybe a Serena Williams, is that I found with Caitlin Clark in this day and age where female athletes in women's sports are able to control their own narrative a bit more. I think she's also started to influence other sports too. I think more people are like, oh, the WNBA is sick. I should give the NWSL a shot. Oh, Caitlin Clark's playing in this Pro-Am tournament with Nelly Corda. I'm going to tune in, and now I'm an LPGA fan. And so I think that, I'm not sure if we saw that crossover as much before with other star athletes, but we are seeing that with Caitlin Clark. And I'm just waiting until Taylor Swift shows up in an Indiana Fever game and we see the WNBA skyrocket in the same way that we've seen the NFL.
And the other thing I'll say about Caitlin too is we live in an age where access to the athletes is more restricted than it's ever been. I mean, you have leagues now are pushing to not have reporters in dress rooms anymore. Yes. They put a player in front of they bring them into a room and let them sit there for 5 minutes and answer questions. And I think from what I've seen, Caitlin's been incredibly accessible to the media people. And again, that's good for everybody. That's good for the Caitlin Clark brand. It's good for the WNBA brand. It's good for the women's sports brand. And that again goes you push the peanut up the hill or down the hill in this case, and it's also good for businesses like The Gist.
Yeah, and you know what? Listen, female athletes recognize that they have to do that because they need to get paid outside of their sport. They know that they have the responsibility not only to play their game, but to broadcast the message that their game is good and to be a champion for the game as well. They've been the best marketers for their own games for probably decades. And so while somebody, like an Anthony Edwards post game can kind of be like, yeah, whatever, I don't care, move along. Although he's very entertaining. I do love his post game press conferences. So maybe he's not the best example, but another guy, another NBA player can just kind of sit there. They can leave if they want. That's fine. They're making millions and millions and millions of dollars per year. And people might tune in anyway. We've seen the NBA viewership numbers obviously being really down the last couple of years, which is why they instituted the NBA Cup. But these female athletes don't have that luxury. And if anyone has that luxury, it only is a Caitlin Clark or an Angel Reese or a Naomi Osaka who are getting paid millions outside of the court otherwise, but they know that they love their sport so much, they want to change things for that next generation, that they feel this responsibility to push things further, which is why they recognize that them showcasing their personality, being available to the media helps that game grow. So I think that it's really just this extra level of responsibility that all of these female athletes, and especially the stars, take really seriously.
Hey, gaming news guys. Are you ready to win a bigger share of Canada's rapidly expanding gaming market? Then GBG are ready to help. As the global leaders in identity verification, GBG partner with over 60% of iGaming Ontario brands to help them onboard more players, maximize match rates, and deliver FinTrack compliance. Visit gbgplc.com today and talk to the trust experts. What are your thoughts on just the timing? It's, some regards, it feels like a perfect storm where you have these great athletes now. You have networks have stepped up to broadcast these games. We're seeing corporate North America step up now to support leagues. The reason the Professional Women's Hockey League exists is because Mark Walder and his wife came along and put in a bunch of money. But there has been very strong corporate support. Diana Matheson obviously believes that the Northern Super League, the time is right to do it, and we've seen they've added some blue chip sponsors, including Canadian Tire, already. I think it probably is a no-brainer for Toronto to get a WNBA franchise, and just given Larry Tannenbaum and Teresa Rush kind of steering that ship, I have no doubt that will be successful. Can you put your finger on, is there any one of those reasons why everything seems to have happened at once for women's sports, Ellen?
Yes. I mean, I think when we look back at it, I really do think that the democratization of social media and of digital media period has changed the game. I think if we were still in a traditional media format where no one was able to control their own message, it was only distributed through these post-game pressers, through magazines, through ESPN or TSN, we'd be in the same place because those people who are making the decisions, thought that everybody only cared about men's sports. And then they started realizing, because of social media, people posting their own stories about women's sports, female athletes sharing their stories, that they're like, oh my God, people, when they're exposed to these games, actually really enjoy them. They want to buy tickets, they want to buy merch, what have you. And so I really do think this is all happening at the same time, because this democratization, Steve, really only started, I'd say, like 7 or 8 years ago. And people really only started thinking about the monetization of that side probably 5 years ago, when you think about it from a sports perspective. So I think that that's really interesting. I do want to give a big caveat here, and asterisk here too, that, women's growth is way more, women's sports growth is way more than men's sports growth. It's also because it's starting at a lower base. And so they're looking at those numbers. It's not the pure number. The percentage is there, right? But it's always going to look different than the men's sports side. But I think also too, it's really important for us to remember that of all sports and entertainment sponsorship money, only 6% goes to women's sports. So it feels like, oh my gosh, there's so much in the space right now. This is so amazing for women's sports. It's 6%. Like, it's still so small. And for us, Steve, when we're in this space, and we're in the men's sports space and the women's sports space, when we're living in this women's sports space, it is an echo chamber. You are seeing the same people every time, talking to the same people, trying to grow their footprint. And there's not enough people who are new coming into it. And so I think that's the hard part. And that's the responsibility of the Gist, other media companies, WNBA Toronto, the NSL, what have you. There needs to be more than 6%. We need to at least get up to 20% of sports and entertainment dollars going towards women's sports. And generally those corporate dollars follow investment dollars by about, I'd say, like 5 to 10 years. And so I wouldn't be surprised, Steve, if we're talking in 5 to 10 years on your podcast again, that number could potentially get up to that 15 to 20%. But it's not like everyone's flocking to women's sports. There's plenty of space left for these corporate players to get in.
Yeah. And it's, for traditional media, it's so difficult because, as we mentioned earlier, newsrooms are shrunk. I mean, when I was sports editor at the Globe and Mail back in the early 2000s, we had a staff and freelancers of about 30 people. I mean, the Globe Sports Department is literally 3 or 4 people today. Mm-hmm. And something I still wrestle with, even though I've been out of traditional sports media now for quite a while. I mean, I've considered myself an advocate for women's sports for a long time. I mean, I always joke with people. I refereed the first unofficial World Women's Hockey Championships back in 1987, and my parents started the first girls hockey program in our hometown of Prescott down in Eastern Ontario, and I've tried to, as a sports editor and as a managing editor, I've tried to hire women. And sometimes it's hard not to be a little bit defensive, because I think the tables have turned. And mm-hmm. Back in my day, and again, people, you can be upset with people like me or not, I guess. But you kind of, at that time, you followed where the interest was. And
for sure.
At the Globe, if the Grey Cup, we sent 3 people to Grey Cup because the Grey Cup mattered to people. And we sent Tom Tebbett, went to every Grand Slam tennis tournament back then, and certainly in Tom's case, we covered the women as much as the men, because especially when I was there was a pretty damn good era of women's tennis there with mm-hmm. the Williams sisters, and when Monica Seles came back, and but it's to your point earlier, I think social media and digital media has made a massive difference, because you don't have traditional media now where you could put a full-time beat writer on the Toronto Scepters, or you're not going to send, the Toronto Sun's not going to send 4 reporters to a PWHL final, because they're not even doing that. They're not doing that with the Maple Leafs anymore.
No, exactly. It's a completely different business model. I mean, also, Steve, like, women weren't allowed to play sports for so long, right? Like, these leagues started later. The NWSL didn't even exist until 2013. The PWHL literally didn't exist until a few years ago. And so I think it's keeping all of that in mind. And it feels like so much growth, but we're in maybe outside of the WNBA and WTA, all of these leagues are in startup and scale up mode. They're not there yet, but that's what's so exciting about them too, is that because they're in that mode, they're open and they're trying new things at the same time.
Yeah, and I think what's exciting too, Ellen, is that I think these leagues recognize that they need to create their own content and have their own media
Mm-hmm.
properties. I just saw over the weekend on LinkedIn at the Northern Super League, they're hiring a head of content or a director of content, and we've seen the PWHL has been very proactive, and the PWHL has also opened opportunities for people to cover the sport and start newsletters, and Ian Kennedy, the hockey news, is all over the PWHL. So there is kind of a shifting, and you mentioned podcasts earlier. I think we're just really just starting to scratch the surface with podcasts, just in terms of monetizing it. I think there's still too many of us out here doing podcasts and not having corporate support, and you hope that that changes over the next 10 years. I mean, I won't be, there won't be a Gaming News Canada podcast by then. I don't think, Alan, but again, you do for jesters, you hope that there's a Canadian Tire or a Dove soap or somebody who's stepping up to sponsor not just your podcast, but those new digital sports media assets that are out there in the marketplace now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's definitely where I think we find with our jesters, at least, jesters are more likely to buy from a brand or use a brand when they see them recommended in our newsletter, because they trust us as their recommenders, but also they know that then that brand is supporting female-led media. They know that brand is also supporting equal coverage. They know that brand is supporting women's sports, and then they're more likely to buy from them the next time that they see them or click out on whatever we're putting in the newsletter too. So the data is trending in that right direction. I think it's also up to us to figure out what is that information that we're able to provide these brands, what's something new for them, and also figuring out how AI is going to play a role in all of this too, right?
Yeah. Are you seeing like our brand stepping up to help your business, Ellen?
Yeah, definitely. So the majority of our revenue is earned through ad-supported business. So on our podcast, The Gist of It, for example, Aflac is our presenting partner for the entire year. It has been so awesome working with Aflac. Our initial agreement with them was to promote how they were supporting March Madness on both the men's side and women's side last year. And then we brought them on as our presenting partner of the podcast for this last year, which is really exciting. We work with so many brands. They really range from, anyone from Verizon to a State Farm to a Nike, all the way to someone like the NBA Canada or Bombas or Canadian Tire in particular as well. And so really working with those brands, at least for us who are looking to have access to an on the go female fan who has disposable income and who's a social influencer in her own right, and where they aren't necessarily able to reach that underserved sports fan when they're spending their money with, a more traditional sports media company, I guess that you could say. They're not necessarily reaching women that way, but they can reach the female fan by leveraging the gist in all of our properties.
Hey, Ellen, we just have a few more minutes, but I want to. We first met back in the summer of 2021 when I was writing the gambling column for the Toronto Star with an eye
Yeah.
towards legalized sports betting coming in April 2022 in Ontario. And I wrote a column on women's sports and women in sport and sports betting back in July 2021. And I just want to read a quote that you gave me back, and leading into a question on just how if your strategy shifted around sports betting and fantasy. And the quote is, we're letting people know how to bet and play fantasy sports. When we talk to an underserved sports fan, when we provide gamification options with education and community at the same time, the game itself becomes a lot more interesting. I think at that time too, I think FanDuel had come on board at the Gist as a partner. I think around the NFL. Alan, how was that? How has the business shifted with respect to sports betting and gamification?
I can't believe it was that long ago, Steve, that we
I know.
chatted.
Yeah.
Yes, 2021, how time flies. I think that in general, that hypothesis still rings true in the sense that people want to be sports fans. People want to feel like they're part of a community. They want to feel like they're in with something. And the way that sports is going to grow the pie is not by only super serving avid fans. You know, Steve, you and I are in. We're in the mix. We're going to be sports fans for life. The way that the industry grows the pie is by reaching new people, which is really where the gist comes in and is welcoming all different levels of sports fans, whether you're completely new to a sport or whether you're an avid sports fan too. And what we've really found is that in order for that new person to feel comfortable in fantasy or pick'ems or brackets or daily betting, they need to feel like they have that base education somewhere. And they almost need to feel like they have that person who they could text and be like, what do you think about this? Where are you getting the resources? What are your thoughts? What have you? So that I think still rings true. I think for us, Steve, what we've really learned though is that daily sports betting for female fans is very different. We found this from some articles from FanDuel as well as DraftKings, and that female fans are growing in terms of their sports betting, but they're not betting as often, and they're really only betting during key tent pools that matter to them. And so that's really not a surprise for us too. Generally people are kind of more social bettors, so they'll want to get in on more prop bets,
Right.
more accessible bets when they know about championships and whatnot too. In terms of the gist and where our business is going, and as we think about this, one thing that we launched this last year is a bracket program. And it's not just a bracket for something like March Madness, but it's a March Madness inspired bracket for all of the postseasons for both men's and women's sports. So we launched it with Olympics, soccer on the women's side in particular. We did it for Major League Baseball postseason. We did it for the WNBA. We're doing it for college football playoff right now. We're going to be doing it for the NFL playoffs too. And what's so interesting, Steve, is our data from that says that even though my favorite team got knocked out in the first round, I was more likely to watch the entire tournament. And so
Right.
for us as a business, that's very interesting because we're like, okay, this gister is going to keep on opening their email. This gister is going to keep following us on social. This gister is going to keep on clicking in their newsletter, and we're serving them properly. But also when we think about our brand partners or prospective brand partners, it's like, if you want this person to continue to engage throughout an entire postseason, even when their local team is out, you should be sponsoring the Just Bracket program, thinking about those ways. And that can range from the media rights holder of that tournament or of that playoff. That could also be a big brand who's like, you know what, we're sponsoring everything through the championships, and we don't want to see a drop off once the Raptors crash out of the playoffs or once the Sixers crash out of the playoffs. We want to make sure we're keeping that Sixers fan all the way until the Bucks win the championship this year, which is really hard to do. So that's been interesting for us. And then next year we have some big plans. I can't share all of them, but we have some big plans to get back into pick'ems and fantasy ourselves with some of our own platforms and technologies. So we're still big in the gamification side, but there's definitely been some adjustments on the daily sports betting itself.
Yeah, and that's the same. We get the same messages when we hear the leagues speak at conferences, Ellen, where especially with the NFL, where you might be a Lions fan, but the Lions play at the 1 o'clock game on a Sunday, and you're placing a bet on the Dallas Eagles game at 4 o'clock. You're invested in that game, and
Yes.
the leagues are saying that they're seeing the television ratings are better. There's just a higher level engagement around not just a game with a fan's favorite team, but across several games because of whether it's betting or fantasy sports or just like a bracket, like you mentioned. Again, it's kind of a rising tide lifts all boats.
Absolutely. And it's really fun to see. And I think that it's all getting back into user behavior. And I mean, the NFL is so smart. I'm obsessed with Red Zone. That's really all I watch
Right.
every single Sunday. And so I'm able to capture everything. And I think it will just be really interesting, especially in Canada, to see how sports betting can roll out to other provinces too.
Hey, Ellen, I'm sure you've read. There's been so much around problem gambling and gambling responsibly, and there's a U.S. congressional hearing on Tuesday about the legal sports gambling landscape in the U.S. You've got in Canada right now, there's a bill in the House of Commons to create a national framework around sports betting advertising. Do you feel any obligation or pressures or something you're dealing with in terms of, again, educating your subscribers that if you are going to bet, you have to do so in a safe way?
We really do when we're working with a brand partner. So when we're working with FanDuel, we are leaning on them, and we're also suggesting to them, hey, what if we added a little asterisk here, kind of talking about sports betting and how to do it responsibly. I will say, I think all of our partners, DraftKings, FanDuel, Bet99, whoever, PointsBet, I think that they have been doing a good job of setting up all of those parameters.
Hey, Alan, last question, and I know you mentioned a couple of minutes ago that you don't want to give away any trade secrets, but can you give me and our listeners just a little taste of what's coming up for the Gist in 2025?
Yes, I can give you a little bit of a taste, a little bit of a teaser. I think you can expect more of the gist of what we've been doing for these last few years, with giving the gist of what's happening in both men's and women's sports in a really fun and entertaining way across our newsletter, podcast, social media. You can look for us to get more into short form video, which we're really looking forward to. We've seen that really take off on Instagram Reels as well as TikTok. Obviously, TikTok might be banned in the US. Had some issues with privacy here in Canada too, but that format of short form video is proving to be really successful in terms of storytelling as well, which is great. We're also looking to get a little bit more into the intersectionality of sports. So covering what's happening in the news, yes, but also thinking about sports and their influence with fashion, sports and their influence with mental health, sports and their influence with climate, and what does that look like in the way that we're covering it and assisting our gisters in that intersectional journey, because we're not all athletes, we're not all only interested in what's happening on the field. We're also interested in how we can host a Super Bowl party with the best things that are available to us. And then I think on that gamification side too, Steve, we're really thinking about bringing back actually something we did in the very early stages of the Gist, bringing back our own Pick'em platform, thinking about educational kind of webinars on the fantasy side of things, most of this around the NFL. And then also thinking about kind of consumer facing products too. So what could an event strategy look like for the Gist? What could a membership look like for the Gist, especially when we really feel like we've built this amazing community of gisters? How are we able to kind of take things out of the newsletter that's really one-on-one special relationship, but kind of bring it into the group chat and bring it into IRL? So we've got a lot to think about. And those are all just kind of high level ideas, but it feels like 2025 is going to be a big year for us and our gisters and sports on the whole.
That's fantastic, Alan. And just for our audience, if you're not a subscriber to the Gist, how do you do that?
Yes, you can go to thegistsports.com, and we have 3 different verticals. So we have a sports news vertical that gives you the gist of what's up in both men's and women's sports, mostly on the pro side of things. So thinking about all the major leagues, WNBA, NWSL, NSL, PWHL, etc. We also have a sports business newsletter that in particular focuses on the business side of women's sports. So if you're interested in covering or following things like name, image, and likeness, any endorsement deals, media transactions, what have you, that's the newsletter for you. And then we also have an NCAA newsletter. So we cover everything college sports. And so right now, of course, with the college football playoff and March Madness coming up, our team covering the NCAA is quite busy. So those are 3 different verticals.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like there'd be too much rest for the wicked, Ellen, over the holidays with NFL playoffs around the corner and everything else.
Yes, there's a lot happening. We're very grateful for our amazing team.
Ellen Hyslop is a co-founder of the Gist, also the head of content. Hey, Ellen, I know I joked at the beginning that this is long overdue, but you and I often share emails together, and I'm just such a huge fan of what you and JC and everybody there has done. And it's funny. I remember, I first met Lisa Minotillo during COVID, and at that time, Lisa was looking to get a full-time sports writing job, and it just LinkedIn such a great vehicle that way, and we started chatting and exchanging emails, and it's so cool to see her doing work for you now, and like you and I, kind of, having the passion that we do for sports and for sports writing or sports media. And so it's a neat story to see someone like Lisa working with you now. And it's a great thing.
Yeah, Lisa's the best. We're so lucky to have her on our team. She's been part-time with us for so long. Her husband is a pro basketball player, so it's kind of back
Right.
and forth to Europe and what have you, but she settled back in Vancouver, and we said, oh gosh, she's finally settled. Amazing. Let's bring her on full time. And so it's been such a treat being able to have her on the team in a full-time capacity.
Yeah, that's great. Just for our audience, as always, you can find the Gaming News Canada show presented by GBG Plc on Substack at gamingnewscanada.ca and also on the various podcast platforms. Ellen, just want to wish you and everybody else at the just a great holiday season, and obviously we'll continue to follow everything you do in 2025 and wishing you continued success.
Thank you. You too, Steve. Really appreciate you having me on.
Great. And thanks everybody else for joining us, and we will see everybody again very soon.
Thank you for listening to the Gaming News Canada show. Sign up for our newsletter at gamingnewscanada.ca. Follow Steve McAllister on LinkedIn. Message Steve if you're interested in being a sponsor or featured guest.